Imagine sitting in a room where you know the answer to a question is written on a piece of paper on the other side of a locked door. You have the key. You've had the key since day one. But the lock is broken, and the locksmith you called told you it might take weeks to fix. Maybe months. Maybe a year. That is the exact situation the investigators in the Nancy Guthrie case woke up to on day 23. They have DNA from inside her home. DNA that does not belong to Nancy. DNA that does not belong to her family or to anyone known to have worked at the property. DNA that the Pima County Sheriff himself said he believes may belong to the person who took her. And right now, in a private laboratory in Florida, that DNA is sitting inside a technical problem that has no guaranteed resolution date. The sheriff said it plainly on Friday, in a sentence that stopped everyone paying close attention to this case. Our lab tells us that there's challenges with it, and we understand those challenges. But our lab also knows that the technology is moving so fast and in such a frenzy that they think some of this stuff will resolve itself just in a matter of weeks, months, or maybe a year. Weeks. Months. Maybe a year. For an 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker and a daily cardiac medication requirement who has been missing since January 31st, that timeline is not just a forensic inconvenience. It is a statement about the gap between what science can theoretically do and what it can deliver when the sample it is working with doesn't cooperate. And today on day 23, this channel is going to explain exactly what that gap means, what is causing it, why it doesn't mean the case is unsolvable, and what it would actually take for the DNA in that Florida lab to open this investigation in a way that no other lead currently can. Because I think the public deserves a real explanation of the science, not a headline and a shrug. And I think when you understand what mixed DNA actually is, what genetic genealogy actually does, and what the specific obstacles in this case actually represent, you're going to see this development very differently than the coverage has suggested. But you're also going to understand why the urgency is real, and why day 23 without a resolution carries a weight that no amount of forensic optimism fully cancels out. Let's start with the basics, because a lot of coverage is using the phrase mixed DNA without explaining what it means in practice. When investigators process a crime scene, they collect biological material from surfaces, fabrics, and areas where physical contact is likely to have occurred. That material contains DNA, but it almost never contains DNA from just one person. A home where someone lives, where family visits, where contractors and cleaners and neighbors have been over the years, is a landscape of overlapping biological traces. The challenge for forensic scientists is not finding DNA. It is finding the right DNA and being able to isolate it cleanly from everything else that surrounds it. When investigators found mixed DNA at Nancy Guthrie's home, what that means is that the sample contains genetic material from more than one person. The sheriff has confirmed that some of that material does not belong to Nancy, does not belong to her family, and does not belong to anyone known to have been at the property recently. That unknown genetic material is what investigators believe may belong to the person who took her. But here is where the science gets complicated, and where I want you to really pay attention, because this is the piece that explains the weeks, months, maybe a year statement. To extract a usable DNA profile from a mixed sample, laboratory scientists have to perform a process called probabilistic genotyping. They are essentially trying to mathematically deconvolute the mixture, to figure out which genetic markers belong to which contributor, using statistical modeling and computational analysis. The difficulty of this process depends on two things: how many contributors are present in the mixture, and the ratio of each contributor's DNA relative to the others. Genetic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick explained this to IB Times UK in a statement that should be required reading for anyone following this case. She said, "Suppose you have a mixture and it's 90% Nancy's and 10% somebody else's. That might not be enough for the lab to go forward and get enough markers and make the identification. Even a 50-50 blend," she added, "can be hard to separate." Barbara Rae-Venter, the genetic genealogist who personally helped identify the Golden State Killer, went further and said the heart of the problem may lie in the mixture itself. If there is too much of the victim's DNA and too little of the unknown contributor, there may simply not be enough signal from the suspect to work with. Think about what that means. The sample might contain the suspect's DNA, the lab might know it's there, and the lab might still be unable to isolate it cleanly enough to produce a profile that can be entered into databases or used for genealogy. That is not a failure of the investigation. That is a limitation of the chemistry, and it is the challenge that the private lab in Florida is currently working through. Now here's the question I want to put to this community, and I want honest answers in the comments below. Given that the sheriff has confirmed the DNA challenge may take up to a year to resolve, and given that Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old with critical medical needs, do you believe the investigation should be pursuing a parallel accelerated path that does not depend on the DNA at all? Because everything I have just described is about one evidence thread. 1. The investigation has others. And I want to talk about those others in detail, because the DNA timeline is not the only clock running in this case, and I think the media's focus on the lab in Florida is causing people to overlook developments that may actually be moving faster. The Walmart backpack thread is the one that receives the least attention relative to its investigative value, and I think that's a mistake. The FBI confirmed that the backpack worn by the suspect is the Ozark Trail 25-liter hiker pack, a house brand sold exclusively at Walmart. Walmart has handed over purchase records covering all sales of that backpack across Arizona to law enforcement investigators. That data set is finite. Every traceable purchase within the investigative window, which the sheriff indicated is approximately 60 to 90 days before the disappearance, represents a name. And here is the thing about a name tied to a Walmart backpack purchase in a specific time frame in a specific state. It is not a needle in a haystack. It is a bounded search space with a manageable number of entries. Investigators cross-reference each name against the physical description of the suspect, against background checks, against geographic proximity to the Catalina foothills. Every name that can be eliminated narrows the field. Every name that cannot be eliminated gets a closer look. Cash purchases are the gap in this approach, and that gap is real. But the sheriff's explicit statement that investigators are looking for a credit card or bank card transaction tied to that backpack suggests confidence that the purchase was not cash. And here is the part I want this community to think about. What does it tell you about the operational sophistication of this person if the backpack was bought with a traceable payment method? Does someone who planned this for 8 months, who researched Nancy's address in June 2025, who removed the doorbell camera before entering, who understood the subscription gap in the secondary motion detection camera, who wore gloves the entire time, pay for his operational equipment with a credit card? That question does not have an obvious answer. And I think the answer, whichever direction it points, tells you something important about who this person is. The holster thread is the one that professional investigators keep returning to in interviews, and I think it deserves more attention than it gets from the public. The sheriff has described the holster as unique more than once. Not just unusual, unique. The configuration seen in the doorbell footage, with the holster positioned in an unusual placement on the body, is specific enough that investigators believe it is identifiable. Detectives have been canvassing gun shops across the Tucson area, showing the video to staff, asking if anyone recognizes the holster or the person wearing it. An Arizona gun store owner confirmed to Fox News that an FBI agent visited and asked him to review recent firearm purchases tied to a list of nearly 24 names. A list. That detail has been almost completely absent from mainstream coverage, and it matters. Because a list of names means investigators are not searching blind. They have generated candidates from other threads of the investigation and are now cross-referencing those candidates with gun shop records. The holster is being used as a verification tool, not just an identification tool. That is a more advanced stage of investigation than the public briefings have suggested. And then there is the clothing thread, which is the newest development as of today's reporting. The sheriff said on Sunday that investigators are getting closer to identifying the shoes, pants, shirt, and jacket worn by the man in the doorbell footage. That is a new public statement about evidence analysis that had not been disclosed before this weekend. Think about what that means operationally. Investigators now potentially have a full clothing profile of the suspect, not just the backpack and the holster, but the entire outfit. Each item of clothing is another potential purchase record, another potential retail source, another potential transaction that may be traceable. The more items in the outfit that can be specifically identified, the more purchase records that can be requested, and the more overlapping data points that could converge on a single buyer. This thread may be less discussed than the DNA, but it represents the kind of systematic physical evidence work that has solved cases when laboratory science was unavailable or delayed. Now, I want to go deeper on the genetic genealogy science, because I think the public understanding of this tool is shaped almost entirely by two famous cases, the Golden State Killer and Brian Kohberger, and those cases have created an impression that the tool is fast, reliable, and essentially magical. It is none of those things. It is powerful, It is unprecedented in its investigative reach, and it has an extraordinary track record. But it operates under constraints that the Nancy Guthrie case is running into at exactly the worst possible time. Investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG as it's known in forensic circles, works by taking a cleaned DNA profile and uploading it to publicly accessible databases where individuals have voluntarily uploaded their own raw DNA data from commercial ancestry tests. The system searches for partial matches, not full matches, but close enough matches to suggest shared ancestry. From those partial matches, genealogists build family trees backward and forward, identifying branches that converge on someone who could plausibly be the source of the crime scene DNA. In the Golden State Killer case, this process produced a second cousin match that Barbara Rae-Venter then used to build a complete family tree that eventually led to Joseph James DeAngelo. In the Koberger case, the same methodology connected crime scene DNA to Brian Koberger's father's profile in a public database, which led investigators to the Sun. But here is the constraint that applies directly to the Nancy Guthrie case, and that CeCe Moore, the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, was unusually direct about in a News Nation interview this weekend. The databases that law enforcement is legally permitted to access for IgG are not Ancestry.com and not 23andMe. Those databases have explicitly barred law enforcement access to protect user privacy. The databases that investigators can use are GED Match and Family Tree DNA, both of which have opt-in capabilities for law enforcement comparison. And the size difference between the permitted and prohibited databases is not marginal. Barbara Rae-Venter, who built the methodology used to catch the Golden State Killer, said this directly. The two databases that we're allowed to use are two of the smallest databases. If we could be using Ancestry or 23andMe or even MyHeritage, those databases are huge. You're talking about 10 to 20 times as many people. The implication of that size difference is significant. A suspect who has no relatives in GD Match or Family Tree DNA will not appear in the IgG search regardless of how clean the DNA profile is. And this is where the racial ancestry element that Moore raised comes into the picture, and where I want you to engage in the comments because this is a dimension of the case that almost no mainstream outlet is discussing honestly. Moore said something this weekend that deserves to be quoted carefully and then analyzed. She said that if the suspect has deep roots in the United States and is white, they could potentially be identified in minutes or hours using IgG, because those populations have the most cousins represented in the accessible databases due to the demographics of commercial DNA testing. If the suspect has ancestry rooted primarily outside the United States, particularly from regions where commercial ancestry testing is less common, the family tree search may produce no close relatives in the accessible databases, which means IgG cannot work regardless of how good the DNA profile is. Moore was explicit that this is not a commentary on the suspect's guilt or innocence. It is a statement about the structural limitation of a tool that is only as powerful as the population data it can access, and it is a limitation that applies specifically to this case given the geographic location of Tucson, Arizona, approximately 65 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border, and the sheriff's acknowledgement that cross-border coordination has been active since day one. I am not speculating about the suspect's background. I am telling you exactly what the forensic expert who pioneered this methodology said about how that background affects the tool's effectiveness. And I think this community deserves to engage with that reality honestly, rather than having it filtered out because it creates complexity. So the question I want you to answer in the comments is this. Given everything Moore said about the database limitations and the ancestry variable, do you think IgG is the most likely path to identifying the suspect in this case? Or do you think the physical evidence threads, the backpack, the holster, the clothing, are more likely to break this open? Let me talk about the ransom communications, because a new development on that front emerged over the weekend that deserves more attention than it received. TMZ confirmed receiving a new email they described as highly sophisticated, involving a cryptocurrency other than Bitcoin, with a demand similar to the original $6 million figure and graphic descriptions of consequences if the demand is not met. The shift from Bitcoin to a different cryptocurrency was flagged by blockchain forensics experts as significant the moment the first ransom note's shift was reported. Monero, which is the privacy-focused cryptocurrency that experts have identified as the likely alternative, uses an architecture that makes transactions essentially untraceable by design. Ring signatures and stealth addresses conceal the sender, the recipient, and the transaction amount simultaneously. Compare that to Bitcoin, which operates on a public ledger where every transaction is permanently recorded and traceable with the right tools. Someone who initially demanded Bitcoin and then shifted to a different currency is someone who either did their research between the first and second communications or had someone advising them who understood the difference. Neither of those scenarios describes an opportunistic amateur. And here's the piece that I find most analytically interesting. The ransom communications have been consistent on one number, $6 million, not an escalating demand, not a decreasing demand in response to the family's response. 6 million in the first note and a similar amount in the most recent note weeks later. That consistency either reflects genuine negotiating discipline or it reflects a calculation made in advance about what a working national television anchor's family could plausibly access. Either way, it is not random. I want to take a moment to address something that is circulating in the comments of this and other channels about this case, because it represents exactly the kind of confusion between confirmed fact and online speculation that can genuinely compromise an active investigation. Multiple theories about specific named individuals, about family connections, about alleged conversations and documents are spreading across social media platforms with varying degrees of plausibility and zero official confirmation. I have consistently covered this case from verified sources only, and I want to be transparent about exactly where each piece of information in this video comes from. The DNA challenges are confirmed by the sheriff in a direct statement to NBC News. The Walmart purchase records being handed to investigators are confirmed by ABC News law enforcement sources. The list of names being cross-referenced at gun shops is confirmed by a gun store owner speaking to Fox News. The IgG database limitations are stated by Barbara Rae-Venter and CeCe Moore in on-the-record interviews. The new ransom communication is confirmed by TMZ. The clothing identification progress is confirmed by the sheriff's statement to NBC News on Sunday. Everything else in this video that is my analysis, my interpretation, or my opinion, I have flagged explicitly. That distinction matters. Because Nancy Guthrie's family is living inside this investigation in real time, and every false lead that 400 investigators have to process is time that is not being spent on real ones. Now let me talk about what the combination of the DNA delay and the scaling back of resources means for the investigation's long-term trajectory, because these two developments happening simultaneously create a dynamic that I think is being underappreciated. The ABC News report from Friday confirmed that sources with knowledge of the investigation believe the 400-agent operation is transitioning to a smaller long-term task force. The DNA delay confirmed by the sheriff means the most potentially definitive evidence thread may not produce results for weeks, months, or a year. Put those two things together, and what you have is an investigation entering a leaner phase at the exact moment its most powerful forensic tool is on an uncertain timeline. That is not a comfortable position. The former FBI hostage negotiation expert Rich Frankel framed the scaling back as standard operational procedure for long-term sustainable investigation. And I believe him when he says that. But I also think the honest acknowledgement has to be made that a leaner task force with a delayed DNA timeline operating on physical evidence threads that may or may not converge is a different investigative picture than what existed on day one. It is not a catastrophic picture. Cases have been solved under exactly these conditions, and sometimes the transition to a focused long-term team is what allows investigators to see patterns that urgency obscured. But it is a different picture, and pretending otherwise would not be fair to the people watching this channel who deserve accurate analysis. Here is what I believe, as my personal read on where this investigation stands on day 23, offered transparently as opinion rather than fact. The DNA is the most likely path to identification if the lab can solve the mixture problem and if the suspect or their relatives are represented in accessible genealogy databases. Both of those conditions are uncertain. The Walmart backpack purchase records are the most likely path to identification if the purchase was traceable and if the geographic window is narrow enough. The sheriff's confidence in pursuing this thread suggests investigators believe the purchase may be traceable. The holster is the most durable physical evidence thread because specialized gun equipment is harder to acquire anonymously than generic retail products, and investigators appear to have already generated a list of candidates from other evidence. The clothing identification represents a new convergence of physical evidence threads that could accelerate the case significantly if specific items can be matched to specific retail sources. And the ransom communications, despite being the most publicly visible thread, are the one I have the least confidence in as an identification pathway, because sophisticated cryptocurrency architecture exists precisely to make that trail difficult to follow. What I am most uncertain about, and what I think this community should be actively discussing, is whether the person who did this is still in Tucson or has been in Tucson at any point since February 1st, because the answer to that question shapes every other element of the investigation in ways that have not been publicly addressed. Tell me in the comments what your read is on that question, because I think it's the most important unspoken variable in this entire case. Day 23. The DNA is in a lab in Florida with a challenge that may take weeks, months, or a year. 400 investigators are transitioning to a leaner long-term task force. Volunteers found a backpack near Nancy's home on Sunday, and it was not the right one. Detectives are getting closer to identifying the full clothing profile of the suspect. A new ransom note arrived. The sheriff said it plainly. We're not there yet. And somewhere in all of that, in the Walmart purchase records and the gun shop canvassing and the probabilistic genotyping and the genealogy database searches and the clothing analysis and the tip lines that have now received over 50,000 contacts, there is an answer. Not a theory, an answer. The kind that produces a name, an address, and a set of handcuffs. The only question is, which path gets there first and how much time there is left for it to matter? If you have specific, credible, actionable information about this case, please contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or the Pima County Sheriff at 520-351-4900. The reward is $2,500, and it is real. And Nancy Guthrie is still out there somewhere, waiting for the right thread to be pulled by the right person at the right moment. That person might be watching this video right now, and they might not know yet that what they saw or heard means something.